Hello, I'm Lieutenant Nathaniel Flint of the Landship Scorpios, and today I'm doing a very important video. I'm a little late for this video, but I was very worried on how to do it. I spent a lot of time learning, listening, seeing how other people reacted, thinking about this video, what message it was appropriate for me to send, and how I wanted to do it, as well as a little bit of fear of how it would backlash on the channel, especially when we're so close. But in the end, this really needs to be said. Today we're going to be discussing steampunk, or more appropriately, the punk in steampunk. Because as many of you know, a lot of communities, a lot of steampunk communities, a lot of historical communities, a lot of these places where we gather online, nowadays that's all we can gather, have a very worrying message. I know I have seen locally in the New England area several groups asking to please keep steampunk on topic, to please leave politics out of steampunk. And it's worrying because this new trend of this wording, let's say, comes at a very specific time. A few months ago, still happening now, when there's something that we all should have been talking about. And I think it's very important to talk about it. I'm very disappointed in a lot of our steampunk groups. Very few have made any sort of statement. And those that have, from what I can tell, have done so at the, let's say, harassment of their members or of specific members. And it's time to talk about something that not everyone agrees with me, including people close to me. And that's how political steampunk is. And what that punk in steampunk stands for. So a lot of people, we like steam, where steampunk's a different word, and we go off and we play pretend. We dress up, we write about these fantastical stories, we make and come up with great gadgets that feel historical and yet futuristic at the same time. We absolutely love the aesthetic of steampunk, but we forget that second phrase is punk. And we get that from genres such as cyberpunk, as everyone knows, beginning of steampunk. And we know that it was just a random word thrown out by some author as a fleeting attempt to try to describe what we were, or what this style of story was. And the truth is that steampunk isn't a genre. We are a culture. We really are. You can have steampunk genres. You can steampunk anything. One thing is for sure, though, we take the Victorian, the kind of industrial era, and we change it. Oftentimes for the better, maybe to be a little more hopeful. While cyberpunk is definitely more dreary about the future, we are a little bit more hopeful about the past. Cyberpunk gets its punk from the punk genre. A group of rebels, a group of youths, bands, artists, fashionistas, and just everyday people who fought against what I can best describe are institutionalized injustices. When you look at a lot of punk music, and you look at a lot of punk bands, you look at a lot of punk art, and even down to their fashion, It is all about trying to uproot the institutionalized injustices or the injustices that they perceive. Many of these fashions are going against gender norms. Many of these songs are going against socioeconomic norms. They're very much fighting against the government, the people, the whatever, and saying this is wrong, these institutionalized norms are wrong, they're broken, they're rigged, and they sing, they dance, they fight, they wear their clothes against those norms. So now we're talking about steampunk and where that punk is supposed to come from in steampunk. That punk is supposed to be standing against Victorian norms. People talk about you punkized it in fashion by adding fingerless gloves. You wear mohawks. We have very open tattoos. We have rips in our clothing. You wear your underwear on the outside. Like, you know, all these things that you've heard time and time again from your favorite steampunk panelists talking about Steampunk 101 or steampunk fashion. But what people forget is the political side of that punk, or political side of steampunk, where we fight against the institutionalized injustices of the Victorian era. I know very few steampunks that try to glorify or try to, let's say, ignore a lot of the institutionalized wrongs of the Victorian era. When you look at our media, when you look at our books, our stories that we write and tell, when you look at our characters who form, you see a lot of strong female leadership. You see a lot of freed black men, or black men who weren't even enslaved, fighting against institutionalized racism and slavery. You see it in the Civil War America and the frontiered America that steampunk takes place in. You see it in the Victorian era America and the fantastical Europe that steampunk takes place in. We have stories of successful inventing black women. We have stories of women who have gone to the stars. And in steampunk, we relish in these. Anyone can make a steampunk character or a steam sona and be whatever they want, because it's possible in our collective worlds, in our genre, of correcting or standing against the wrongs of the industrial age. Imagining what life could have been like if we could have learned from the mistakes of our past and seen what a more utopic world would have looked like. Stories who don't have these in them, attack them head on. When things like sexism and racism are brought up in steampunk stories, they are attacked head on. They are the villains of our stories. They talk about, or they amplify why these were incorrect, why they were flawed, why they were wrong. And many of you know what I'm eventually getting to, and that's how does a genre with these ideals, with these specifications, have so many groups, steampunk organizations, steampunk region groups, demanding that their members and their steampunks keep politics out of steampunk. They ask people to please stay on topic. They ask people to please bring it to their personal pages. They talk about not standing for it. I'm here to tell you that steampunk is political. Steampunk is punk. And to call yourself a steampunk, you have responsibilities. I'm not even going to sit here and talk about your responsibility as a citizen, your responsibility as a decent human being. I'm not going to sit here and preach at you about my political beliefs. However, I will sit here and preach to you about steampunk political beliefs. Now is a time across the world where it's very important that steampunk protects its own. And we protect those who don't even know that we exist, or don't have the opportunity to live in the fantasy lands that we live in. It's very important right now that we lift up the voices of the many who are treated like the few. Steampunk is full of people of color, of Latinos, of Asians, of Native peoples who are not glorified in our works. Their voices are not lifted up. It's really sad that the best examples of fighting against racial injustices in our literature are written by people whose ancestors didn't suffer that same thing. It's very important right now for your communities, for your groups, for your regions, for your events, to stand tall and let them know that your steampunk Black lives matter, that your Asian lives matter, that your Native lives matter. It's important to give them representation that they can look up to in their steampunk characters and models and in their stories, but in their events and communities. Right now, our world is on fire, fighting racial injustice. And a given should be that steampunks are there, holding signs, at the most sharing the hashtags, at the absolute bare minimum you could do as an ally of these problems. And instead, we find many steampunk groups looking the other way, strangely silent. At worst, we see many groups or group moderators deleting the content, banning users, saying, "Keep your politics out of our group." If you are not a steampunk who stands against institutionalized injustices like racial injustice, sexual injustice, misogyny, you are not a punk. You are not a steampunk. You do not stand with us. This is a very unpopular opinion. I'm going to get a lot of backlash for this, and I have. Those of you who follow my Facebook, I have stood by these words. I may have struggled how to make this video, but I have not struggled on how to act and what to say. And I am not the person to be talking about this. But so few are, not in the world, but in our steampunk communities, that I think it's important. There are a lot of people saying it is not enough to not be racist. We must be anti-racist. A lot of people don't understand what this means. They think it means cancel culture, running out and canceling anyone who's ever said something that wasn't exactly right. Anyone who said things that were insensitive. No, that is not the case. It does mean outright spitting at racism when you see it. You must call it out on the streets. You must call it out at your events. You must call it out through your leadership, through your videos, in the media that you consume. You can't keep politics at home. We must be anti-racist so that racism does not flourish in our steampunk. So that the romanticizing of the Victorian era doesn't turn into a weird nationalist of Victorian England and Victorian America ideals. Dandy Wellington has said in his videos, "Although my fashion may be old-timey, my values are not." And this is a phrase that ever since I heard it in one of his videos, I'll link it down below, I have really tried to live by this. He has merch, if you want to support him, that says vintage style, not vintage values. And this is important. People look at our clothes, they look at our stories, they look at what we call ourselves and how we describe ourselves, and they attribute the values we hold to that clothing, to those stories, those eras, those ideals. Unless we are anti-racist, unless we are anti-sexist, we will be fighting against those stereotypes to our clothing, to our uniforms, to our costumes, to our events. It's not enough to stay quiet. It's not enough to have a terms of service that says you will delete things when they happen. We must be anti-racist, and in that way we must be not afraid to say Black Lives Matter, to say women's lives matter, just as long as your answer isn't keep politics at home. If you call yourself a steampunk but you do not stand for institutionalized injustices, you don't deserve to be a part of this community. You don't deserve to be a steampunk. You are a historical reenactor at best, or a Victorian fantasizer at worst, I guess. If you call yourself a steampunk, but you believe in these institutionalized racisms, or you're a denier, you're even worse. We don't want you in our community. We are an inclusive community by being exclusive to your kind. You must be able to stand with the Black steampunks, Indian steampunks, Native American steampunks, Latino steampunks, Asian steampunks, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, wherever steampunks gather. You must stand with them because they're one of us, but they're not treated like it. Your group that asks you to stay silent or asks you to stay in line so that there isn't disruption to the norm, they need to be taken down, or they need to have new leadership. Because if your norm is disrupted by a political message that we all count and that we all deserve to be here, that is not a norm steampunks want. That is not a norm we've been fighting for. That is not a norm we fantasize about. I guess this video has gone on long enough on a topic that I already shouldn't be talking about. I'll try to put down resources in my description. It's resources protesters have already been sharing at their protests, which have happened around the world. If you missed it, it's more on you. If you are a person of color in your steampunk community, stand up for your rights. I'm not saying go around canceling everyone who has ever done something or forever who didn't talk. But don't allow your community that you're a part of to be silent on this matter. Do not allow them to ask you to keep politics at home. That's not the steampunk way. And it's bad enough you get that out of your actual communities, whether they be in the South or the North or the East or the West. We all have them, areas that they already don't want you talking such disruptive things. But steampunk should be a place where we idolize these ideals, not try to keep them silent. Please support the people of color in our community. Buy their books, support their pages, amplify their YouTubes and their voices, go to their panels. A few events when they come back, we'll have people of color talking about what it's like to be them in the steampunk community, or what it's like to be them in science fiction. Go to those panels. So if I've offended people, the comments are open. I don't plan on doing so many political videos, but I do cover steampunk content. This might be the only video of its kind on my channel. If you're wondering where Landship Scorpius stands, this video will be the end-all, be-all. It's because I'm sickened by the silence. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please support the people of color in your communities. Please remember what the punk in steampunk stands for.